All right. Well, hey, thank you for being here. Hope you all are doing well. We are in the 23rd chapter of Proverbs, an extension of the back half of chapter 22, which we introduced last week, this heading, The Sayings of the Wise. We continue to work our way through it today. Some themes, I think, stand out today. There's some things in here about not chasing after money, about not being beholden to the rich, about not overdoing it or underdoing it. It's an interesting chapter in that I think it has some balance in it, and then ends with some words that I think are appropriate for a young person entering the world. So let's jump in here. Michael, you may have something else. The first thing that really kind of got my attention was verse 4. Do not wear yourself out to get rich. Be wise enough to desist. And it's interesting. The phrasing of this proverb is interesting in that the wisdom comes in fighting back a temptation. In other words, the author seems to assume that we will naturally be inclined to want to amass a fortune, to get more stuff. But the wisdom he offers is the wisdom to deny that temptation, not to chase after it, for in his eyes, that would lead us to foolishness.
Yeah, it's obviously one of those things that we recognize is this sort of wheel that gets put in front of us, this idea that if you keep working and working and working towards whatever the thing, I think rich is many things to many different people. And I think sometimes we turn on our TVs and we see cars and houses and vacations, and that's the kind of image of rich that we have. But rich is more determinative of the things that you let determine what you're going to work toward, what you're going to spend your mental time and energy on. And I think as you turn to this, anything that wears you out that doesn't have eternal value is ultimately going to be null and void. And that's one of those things easier said than done. That's a phrase I find myself saying a lot in this study of Proverbs, that fundamentally whatever wears us out should be a thing that has eternal value.
Yeah, and interestingly, we go from there to the exact opposite. Verse 6 caught my eye. Mm-hmm. Do not eat the bread of the stingy or desire their delicacies, for like a hair in the throat, so are they. Eat and drink, they say to you, but they do not mean it. So just on the heels of being warned about pursuing too much is a warning about those who are not gracious, those who are not generous, those who are unable to give, and their generosity is false. They may make the offer, but they don't mean it, and they're keeping score, and they're counting. And a really fun image here, like a hair in the throat, something irritating, something to be coughed up, that they are a nuisance. And I think it's very interesting the way in which these two proverbs are positioned next to each other. One about seeking too much, and one about not keeping company with those who give too little. And in some cases, those are one and the same. That crowd is not mutually exclusive. But I think that putting these two proverbs next to each other, Michael, is really kind of a neat way to present them.
Yeah, completely. I think my next is verse 12. Is that okay?
Sure.
Apply your mind to instruction and your ear to words of knowledge, which is funny because you're reading the book of Proverbs, so that is par for that course, right? But when you really survey and think through in the course of your life, there are people who we've all met at some juncture of our journeys who were not interested in instruction, who resisted more knowledge. And though I think most joining our conversation today are going to be pro-knowledge, they're going to be pro-instruction, you're here for this time together, I do think it's good to pause and reflect that being a person whose life is oriented towards learning is essential. And we should always be those who are open to new light on something that we think we already know. Because if we're not, obviously that has implications as the world changes, but it also has implications for our faith, because God is always revealing more by the power of the Spirit, and we're going to miss that revelation if we're unwilling to learn.
Yeah, a few years ago, there was a popular phrase that was put out in kind of self-help and, progressive, kind of the idea of personal growth, progression literature, that was lifelong learning. And the idea was that we were challenged to be lifelong learners, that even as we age, if we can find new things to seek to understand, if we can undertake new hobbies or learn new ways of doing things, or even be willing to change some of the ways that we do things, that it sparks more growth. It gives us more of an opportunity to expand our horizons. And I think, though self-help is not generally a category the Bible is very interested in, the idea of being an open learner is, I think, important scripturally. And the idea of continuing to seek new knowledge, new wisdom, in this case, new application, new ways to live out the faith. I think the Bible very much treasures the idea of progress and of moving past wherever it is we are at the moment. I think that's well said, Michael. The next one, I was in 13 here. Do not withhold discipline from your children. If you beat them with the rod, they will not die. If you beat them with the rod, you will save their lives from the pit, from Sheol. Now, obviously, in our day and age, language about beating children with a rod is problematic. It probably doesn't mean abuse in the context it's written. It means, punishment. But this phrase, though I think not offensive in its day, is likely very offensive in ours. But if we can get past that imagery, if we can understand that the Bible is not telling us to beat our kids with sticks or bats or anything, if we understand this is not a call to abuse, we can, I think, find wisdom in this, because I suspect all of us at some point have been around a child that is undisciplined. Mm-hmm. And by that, I don't mean a child being a child. Children are designed to look for the edges and push. Many children, myself included, major in where's the boundary and how can we move it. That's what kids do, and in many ways, that's what kids are supposed to do. It is the parent's job, though, to affix those boundaries and to set appropriate response when the child steps over them. And if you've been around people who, either through lack of interest or ability or philosophy, whatever, if you've been around people who for whatever reason simply don't discipline their children, you know what an uncomfortable moment that is when the nephew, when the niece, when the neighbor kid, when the whoever it is just running roughshod and breaking things and doing dangerous things and getting away with things, and you're just more and more uncomfortable. I think we can see the wisdom in something like that. Children need discipline. Now, again, we could have lots of arguments about what the best way to enact that is, but I think behind that would be an agreement. Children should not be left to their own. There should be fences. There should be rules. There should be consequences. And we do our children a disservice when we don't provide them in some context. Again, beating them with rods, no, we've moved past that day by and large. But it doesn't mean the concept isn't sound.
Yeah, Clint, the reality is that lots of times that conversation looks like, well, I don't want to hurt them. And I'm once again, I'm not talking physical, but the idea is I don't want to have discipline that hurts my child's feeling. There is culturally, and I don't want to paint with too broad a brush here, Clint, but there is this sense that parents in today's age do feel the temptation for their children to be their friend. And so the idea that you're going to instill boundaries and that there might be consequences for transgressing those boundaries, I think brings with it this idea, well, I don't want to hurt them. I don't want to hurt their feelings. And what's, I think, telling about this proverb is that you are doing harm by not. The idea that you're going to let your child go into the world and not recognize that there are boundaries, to not recognize that there will be consequences when they cross those boundaries. And there are children, I by nature of being, in the youth ministries here at the church, have had students who have not in their life experience yet experienced a hard boundary. And those kids often just spiral. They struggle to find traction in life. And, it is important that you strike a balance between, of course, a connected relationship with your child, but also there's got to be some level of, there has to be a referee to enforce the rules, because if there's not, the rules don't matter.
Yeah, and kids need to hear no. I mean, we live in a world where every answer can't be yes to a child if that child is going to grow up and be a healthy adult. And so the language is disturbing here, but the point, I think, is solid. Michael, next one for me, I jumped down to 20. I don't want to say a whole lot about it because I think, we see this very strongly at the end of the chapter, but do not be among the wine bibers, the drinkers, or among gluttons, the eaters of meat. For the drunkard and the glutton will come to poverty, and drowsiness will clothe them with rags. There is a sort of theme that runs through this, really a contrast of themes that runs through this chapter. On the one hand, those who are stingy and small, and on the other hand, those who overdo it. And I think this sets up well for what is said at the end of the chapter, but essentially wisdom does not overindulge in anything. Maybe discipline, but wisdom is not, it is not the character of wisdom to overdo things or to overindulge.
Yeah, that's going to go on as we go further into sexual gratification in verse 27 and 28. And I think that it's an interesting connection here between this idea of overdoing it, to simplify, Clint, and also this idea of honoring your parents, this idea of wisdom and discipline, because we have later on this idea of a father who can have respect and can have really pride in his son. I think these things are interestingly connected because the family life, the relationship between parent and child, is really held up by moderation, by the ability for both parties to go forward together with some sort of synchrony, some sort of harmony. And that may be such an easy thing to say, Clint, the idea of mutual respect, the idea of the parent being able to set boundaries and the child being able to follow them, have respect for that. But that's extraordinary. We know that from our own personal experience of the world, that's a beautiful thing when it happens. And I think it's interesting to see them connected in this chapter.
Yeah, and then we end along those lines, but in a very specific theme with essentially drinking. And it is fascinating historically, looking back even thousands and thousands of years, that fathers still felt the need to warn their sons about the danger of overdoing it in regards to alcohol. And though they wouldn't have had a word like alcoholism, it's not hard to overlay our understanding of that condition on these words. Who has woe and sorrow, strife, complaining, who wounds without cause, who has red eyes, those who linger late over wine and keep trying mixed wine. Do not look at the wine when it is red and sparkles in the cup and goes down smoothly. At the last it bites like a serpent and stings like an adder. Again, having a college freshman, I can imagine the importance of this author trying to convey to his young son the danger of drinking. And here it looks good, it goes down smoothly, it's fun at first, but in the end it bites like a serpent, and you see strange things, and your mind utters perverse things, and you're like one who lies down in the middle of the sea, one who lies down on the top of the mast, and you say, they struck me, but I wasn't hurt, they beat me, but I didn't feel it. And when I shall awake, I will seek another drink. I don't know of something that has affected probably more people in all of our circles. If there was a condition that has done people great harm that we have probably all encountered, it is likely to be alcoholism, or at least overdoing drinking. Whether or not we talk about that as a clinical condition or whether we just talk about it as a personal practice, I suspect every single one of us, either in our family or our circle of friends, is aware of a person who has struggled in their life, largely due to drinking and the things that go with it and the things behind it. And it's interesting. I think so far, Michael, this may be the most expanded part we've seen, or at least the longest single idea that we've seen in Proverbs put together in a string of verses. And I think I can sort of see why.
It's amazing how many of our core human struggles have been universal. It's helpful, I think, as people who live in this time and place to recognize that there have been struggles that have existed as long as we have recorded history. And the fact that this gets included in the Proverbs so poetically, I'm not certain that many parents have the conversation with their child about the thing that glows red and then the serpent's bite at the end. But the beautiful imagery that surrounds it, I think, helps us hear it in a way that we might struggle to hear it otherwise. And Clint, my experience of alcoholism has been that often those closest to it, those who are most affected by it, struggle to see it the most. They just cannot comprehend. There are not words that really illumine that temptation and that cycle of continually going back. And I think that this is a fascinating way to frame it, because it is visual, it's descriptive, it's powerful, and a reminder of how dangerous it is.
Yeah, and that it is a long, subtle road, one that it's a noose that tightens slowly until one is largely in a place where they're no longer in control by the time it's obvious, at least to them, often maybe not to those around them. But by the time someone admits there's a struggle, generally speaking, that struggle is very well entrenched. And so caution on the front end, were more people able to practice that, would certainly be a wisdom, a way to live out wisdom, and probably helpful. I have to suspect that many people whose lives have been affected by alcoholism wish they could have taken a different tact on the front end and wish they had made different decisions and wiser choices. But
I think the only thing I would add there, Clint, and I've read several articles now in the past few months, and I'm no sociologist, but it seems to make sense about the present moment and the anxieties that we have and all of the opposition and cultural things going on, that there seems to be, at least in some research, an increased level of depression and anxiety and sort of mental health disorders happening at the moment. And alcoholism is almost always, not always, but is very often wrapped up in the midst of that. So if you find yourself at a place with alcohol you haven't been in the past, this might be the conversation to take pause and reflect on that. It is a slow process, and we being in a moment when we have less engagement with friends, we're out less, people see us less. It's a moment where it may be the right time to stop and to say no to something that's become ever increasingly available.
Yeah, and for whatever reason, this isn't one of my struggles. I'm not a person who drinks, and I have plenty of other things that I wrestle with instead. But for a non-drinker to listen in on the conversations throughout this period of whether liquor stores are essential, et cetera, and to see the chart on alcohol sales, which have just gone up and up and up during this pandemic, it is certainly a little bit worrisome from a mental health standpoint. And again, we want to be clear. We make sure we should mention that the Scripture is not anti-alcohol. It is pro-moderation. It is pro-good decisions, and it is certainly anti-addiction. So just for what that's worth, but it is an interesting and I think helpful place that the Proverbs takes us in those verses.
Friends, that being said, be blessed. We look forward to our next conversation with you tomorrow. The only note I'd have is the next Pastor Talk podcast on our series Presby What comes out tomorrow at 9 o'clock Central. And in that, we're going to be talking a little bit about what Presbyterianism is in transition. Sort of historically, what are some of the challenges and how has that affected our fellowship? And I think there's some interesting things in that conversation. So I'd love to have you join us for that.
Hey, thanks, everybody.
Thank you for spending time with us today as we study Scripture together. If you haven't already, we would invite you to follow us on Facebook or subscribe on YouTube. It's a great way to get notified when these studies happen every day at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time. Of course, if you've already done that, we would love for you to be able to give the video a like, to share it if you're on Facebook. This is a great way for other people to find the Bible study and be able to join us in this time studying Scripture. If this is your first time here, welcome. It's such a joy to have you be with us this day, and we would love to get to know you better. We would love if you wouldn't mind just taking a minute to go to our website, fpcspiritlake.org/welcome. We'd love to get your name and email address, and we'll follow up with you personally to thank you for spending time with us this day. And for each and every person that is able to study Scripture and engage in this conversation, we want to say thank you. We look forward to our next time with you every weekday at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time. And until then, God bless.